Moving to Salem, Massachusetts was supposed to be a fresh start for my family. My wife, Vanessa, and I had been searching for the perfect house, somewhere quiet, spacious, and far from the chaos of the city. When we found the old colonial home on the outskirts of town, it seemed like everything we wanted. It had charm, history, and a backyard big enough for our two kids, Oliver and Lily, to play in. The only thing that felt off was the statues. Scattered throughout the backyard, half hidden among overgrown grass and dead leaves, were several weathered stone figures. Some were small, others nearly life-sized. Their designs were eerie. Some had twisted faces, others were missing limbs, and a few looked as if they were watching. The real estate agent told us they had been there for decades, left behind by the previous owners who were obsessed with historic art. I remember joking about them at the time, saying we could always move them if they creeped us out. But we never did. The first time I noticed something strange was about a week after we moved in. I was standing on the back porch, drinking coffee and watching the kids chase each other around the yard, when I realized one of the statues had shifted. It was subtle, but I could have sworn it had been facing the opposite direction the day before. I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe Vanessa moving it without mentioning anything. But the next morning, another statue had turned. This time I knew for sure because I had walked past it the night before, and it had been facing the fence. Now it was looking toward the house. Vanessa thought I was overreacting. Maybe the wind moved them, she joked, nudging me playfully. I didn't laugh. These things were made of solid stone. There was no way they were shifting on their own. Then one evening, as I stepped outside to take out the trash, I stopped cold. All the statues had moved. Every single one of them was now positioned in a perfect semicircle at the edge of the yard, all facing the house. Watching. I had no words. My skin crawled, and for the first time since moving in, I felt something I couldn't quite explain. Like we weren't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the sight of those statues in my head, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe Vanessa had moved them as a prank. Maybe the kids had been playing with them. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. At around 2 a.m., a sound pulled me from my restless thoughts. A low, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. Vanessa was still asleep beside me. Slowly, I got out of bed, careful not to wake her, and tiptoed to the window. Peering through the curtains, my stomach dropped. The statues had moved again. They were now even closer to the house, lined up directly in front of the porch steps. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the yard, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the cold night air and those lifeless stone figures, standing in perfect formation. I grabbed a flashlight and, against every instinct screaming at me to stay inside, I stepped onto the porch. The moment my light hit the statues, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I could have sworn the closest one, an angel with a missing face, was just a few inches nearer than before. Then I saw it. Something had been carved into the wooden steps in large, uneven letters. Leave. I woke Vanessa up immediately. She groggily followed me to the porch, wrapping her robe around herself, and stared at the message. Her face paled. Okay. That wasn't there before, she admitted. I exhaled sharply. No, it wasn't. We called the police. They arrived half an hour later, shining their flashlights over the yard and inspecting the statues. But as expected, they found no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. Probably just some kids messing with you, one of the officers said, writing something down in his notepad. Happens more often than you'd think, especially with houses like these. I didn't argue, but I knew they were wrong. That night, a heavy storm rolled in. The wind howled against the windows, rain lashed against the roof. I was exhausted, but every time I closed my eyes, the same image crept into my mind, those statues watching. Then, just past 3 a.m., Vanessa let out a sharp gasp. I turned over, startled. What is it? She didn't speak, just pointed toward the bedroom window. Through the streaks of rain, I saw it. A tall, shadowy figure standing in the yard, completely still. It wasn't one of the statues. It was something else, and it was looking right at us. I bolted out of bed, my pulse hammering. Vanessa grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Bradley, don't." But I couldn't just sit there and watch. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and rushed downstairs. Rain pounded against the windows as I flung the front door open, stepping onto the porch. The wind howled, but through the darkness, I could still see it, standing there, just beyond the statues. A towering figure, motionless. No face, no features. Just an eerie silhouette, its presence sending ice through my veins. I lifted the bat, my grip tightening. "Who the hell are you?" I shouted over the storm. "What do you want?" No response. I took a step forward. The figure twitched, not a normal movement, more like a jerk, like something that didn't fully understand how a body should move. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Vanessa screamed. I spun around just in time to see her backing away from the window upstairs, hands over her mouth. I rushed inside, my breath ragged. "What happened?" She pointed toward the backyard. "Bradley, the statues. They moved." I turned and felt my stomach drop. The statues were no longer in the yard. They were on the porch, right outside the door. One of them, a hooded figure with hollow eyes, was now pressed against the glass, its stone hands raised as if trying to claw its way inside. We spent the rest of the night locked in the bedroom, barely speaking, barely breathing. When morning finally came, the rain had stopped. Cautiously, I crept downstairs. The statues were back in the yard, exactly where they had been the day before. The word "leave" had been scratched deeper into the porch, and something new had been added beneath it. Last warning. That was enough for us. We packed our bags that same day. By nightfall, we were gone. We never found out who or what was behind it. Weeks later, out of curiosity, I searched for information about the house. Turns out, the original owner had collected statues from abandoned graveyards all over Massachusetts. He believed they held spirits, trapped in stone. When he died under mysterious circumstances, the house remained abandoned until we moved in. I still dream about that place sometimes. And in those dreams, I see the statues, standing in the dark, waiting, watching. Moving into a house in the middle of nowhere was supposed to be a fresh start. Lauren and I had spent years drowning in city noise, and when we found this old place in Flagstaff, Arizona, it felt perfect. A little too perfect. It was cheap, suspiciously cheap. The house was massive, built in the 50s with creaky wooden floors and a long, winding driveway surrounded by pine trees. The real estate agent told us it had belonged to an old man who had passed away a few months ago, and that his family just wanted to sell it quickly. I should have asked why. The first few days were normal. Unpacking, fixing little things, getting used to the eerie silence at night. But on the third night, the light started flickering. Not just a small glitch. Full blackouts, lasting several seconds before buzzing back on. Being an electrician, I figured it was just old wiring, something I could fix myself, until I checked the breaker box. The switches weren't tripping, the circuits were fine, yet the power kept cutting out. Frustrated, I decided to check the basement. We hadn't really explored it since moving in. I took a flashlight and headed down. The air felt colder there, heavier. The smell of damp wood and rust filled my nose. The basement was cluttered. Old furniture, boxes of junk, piles of newspapers from decades ago. And then, I saw it. A metal door built into the far wall. It didn't match the rest of the house. It looked industrial, thick with scratches around the handle, like someone had been desperately clawing at it. The moment I touched it, a shiver ran through me. It was locked. I spent the next hour searching through old drawers and cabinets, hoping to find a key. Nothing. The previous owner must have left it behind, but where? That night I mentioned it to Lauren. She shrugged. Probably just an old storage room, she said. Yeah, I lied. Because something about that door felt wrong. The next day I decided to ask around. There weren't many neighbors, just one house down the road, barely visible through the trees. I walked over and knocked. An older man, maybe in his late 60s, answered. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. Mr. Hawthorne, that's what the mailbox said. You're the new owner? He asked, glancing at my house like it was a graveyard. Yeah, just moved in. I was wondering, do you know anything about the basement? The change in his expression was instant. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. What about it? There's a metal door down there, locked. You wouldn't happen to know? Don't open it. I blinked. Why? Mr. Hawthorne looked past me toward the tree line. His fingers twitched at his side like he wanted to slam the door but was holding himself back. Some doors, he muttered, should stay closed. Then, without another word, he shut the door in my face. That night, the flickering lights returned. Lauren had gone to bed early, but I stayed up, scrolling through my phone in the living room, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, until I heard it. A metallic scraping sound. I sat up straight. The noise was faint, but unmistakable, coming from beneath the floorboards. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the basement. The moment I stepped down the last stair, the sound stopped. The basement was still, silent. But something was different. The metal door, which had been firmly shut the day before, was now slightly open, just an inch. Cold air seeped through the gap. I stepped closer. My fingers hovered over the edge of the door. Before I could touch it, a sharp creak echoed through the basement. I turned. Nothing. But I swear, just for a second I thought I saw something shift in the darkness of the room. I should have locked the basement and ignored it. I should have listened to Mr. Hawthorne, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. The next morning I went into town and bought a crowbar. Lauren was at work, so she wouldn't be around to stop me. I stood in front of the metal door, hesitating for a moment before forcing the crowbar between the frame and the lock. Crack. The latch broke and the door creaked open. A wave of cold, stale air hit me. The room inside was small, barely the size of a walk-in closet. The walls were lined with deep scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. In the center of the room was an old, moldy mattress. Beside it, a rusted chain bolted to the floor, the end snapped clean off. But the worst part? A hole. At the back of the room, barely visible in the dim light, there was a narrow tunnel carved into the earth, and something inside moved. I took a step back, my pulse hammering. The tunnel was too dark to see into, but I could hear it, a faint wheezing breath. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't the wind. Something, someone, was in there. I slammed the metal door shut and locked it with a thick chain I had brought from the garage. My hands were shaking as I backed away. That night, Lauren came home to find me sitting in the living room gripping a baseball bat. "What's wrong?" she asked. I hesitated. If I told her, she'd want to leave. I didn't want to scare her, so I just said, "I think we have squatters." She frowned. "Like homeless people?" "I don't know," I lied. And then, as if on cue, we heard it. A single knock. Not at the front door, not at the windows, from beneath the floorboards. Lauren grabbed my arm, her face pale. "That came from the basement." I nodded, gripping the bat tighter. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I even tell them? "Hey, officer, someone, or something, is knocking from a hidden room in my basement." Instead, I did something stupid. I went down there. Lauren stayed at the top of the stairs, flashlight trembling in her hands. I reached the basement floor, my pulse pounding. The chain around the metal door was gone. The door was wide open. The tunnel at the back of the room seemed even darker than before. And in the silence, I heard it again, breathing. "Who's there?" I called out. Silence. Then, a whisper, barely audible. "Help me." It didn't sound right. The voice was off, like it was being forced through a throat that hadn't spoken in years. Then footsteps. Not from the tunnel. From upstairs. Lauren screamed. I ran up, my heart slamming against my ribs. She was backing away from the front door, staring at it in horror. Someone was standing on the other side. The doorknob twisted violently, shaking the entire frame. And then, a single deliberate knock. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The second I did, the knocking stopped. By the time the police arrived, there was no one outside. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. But when they searched the basement, they found something worse. The tunnel, it wasn't just a hole. It stretched deep underground, connecting to a larger network of hidden passages beneath the house. And at the very end of it, a rusted metal door leading directly into the forest. Someone had been living down there, coming and going without us ever knowing. The police tried to track them, but the tunnels were old, crumbling. Whoever had been using them had disappeared. Lauren and I left the house that night. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The house was completely dark, except for one window. A single dim light was glowing from the basement, like someone was still down there, watching us leave. Last winter, I moved to Billings, Montana for a new job. It was a huge step in my career, so I didn't think twice before accepting it. The only problem? I had never actually explored the town before. I visited once for my interview, and that was it. Since it was in the middle of nowhere, finding a rental wasn't easy. I had to do everything online, which wasn't ideal, but I figured it would be fine since I only planned to stay for a year. On December 2nd, I packed everything I owned into my truck and made the long drive. I only stopped once to fill up the tank, but even then, I didn't arrive until after 9 p.m. The town was eerily silent. I had seen Billings during the day, but at night, it was unsettling. The streetlights were dim and most of the businesses were closed, leaving long stretches of darkness between them. There were barely any cars on the road, and the ones that passed by didn't slow down or seem to acknowledge my presence. It almost felt like I was driving through a ghost town. After another 5 minutes, I pulled into the neighborhood and up to my new rental house. It was small and old, sitting in a row of nearly identical homes. I parked in the driveway, grabbed my air mattress from the truck, and headed inside. I had sold most of my furniture before the move, planning to buy new things once I got settled. That meant the house would be mostly empty for a while. Inside, the place was about what I expected: old, outdated, and creaky. The wooden floorboards groaned under every step, and the air had a stale, musty smell. It was a single-story house with a small kitchen, a living room, and a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. After a quick look around, I turned off the lights and went into the master bedroom. I tossed the air mattress on the floor and turned on the pump. As I sat on the cold wooden floor, exhausted from the long drive, I heard it, a creak. It came from the other side of the house. It was just a single creak, but it was sharp and distinct, the kind that comes from someone stepping on an old floorboard. I froze. The house had been empty for a while, so I thought maybe some small animal had gotten inside. A raccoon, maybe. Still, I wasn't eager to deal with that right now. I forced myself to my feet and walked down the hallway toward the living room. I didn't bother turning the lights back on, I just peeked inside. Nothing. The room was as empty as before. No movement, no signs of anything being out of place. I sighed, convincing myself it was just my nerves. Moving into a new house alone could mess with your head, right? I went back to the bedroom, and by then my mattress was full. I threw a blanket over it, lay down, and pulled my hoodie tighter around me. The house felt colder than it should have. Tomorrow, I had a lot to do. I just needed sleep. I closed my eyes, but something didn't feel right. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up again. The room was pitch black, not just dark, but the kind of darkness where you're not even sure your eyes are open. I blinked a few times trying to adjust, but nothing changed. It felt suffocating. That's when I heard it. A creak right in front of me. I shot up, my heart pounding. The room was still impossibly dark, but I stared straight ahead, listening. My breath felt too loud, my chest rising and falling rapidly. Then another creak, closer. A slow, deliberate step. Something was in the room with me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, frozen in the darkness, listening. Another creak, this time further to the left. In my head, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house was just settling. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe. 4 more creaks, getting closer. At this point, my body reacted before my mind did. My hands pressed against the cold wooden floor, and I shifted to get up. But the moment I moved, the floor creaked again. But this time it wasn't me. Something was standing just a few feet in front of me. I could feel it. The air felt thick, like I was being suffocated by the weight of whatever was in the room with me. Then, for just a second, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I swear, I saw something. A faint shape, a shadow standing near the bedroom door. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the door swung open violently. The dim moonlight from the hallway spilled in, and for a split second, I saw him. A man, mid-40s, dirty clothes, heavy boots, standing in my room. He bolted into the hallway, sprinting toward the front door. For a moment, I couldn't move. It was like my brain refused to keep up with what just happened. Then, all at once, my body kicked into overdrive. I threw myself off the air mattress, rushing toward the hallway just in time to hear the front door slam open. By the time I reached the living room, he was gone. The front door was wide open, swaying in the freezing wind. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I grabbed my phone off the counter, my hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. I stepped outside, looking in both directions, but the street was empty. No cars, no people, no sound. It was like the whole town was dead asleep, except for me. I jumped into my truck, locked the doors, and called 911. The dispatcher sounded half asleep when she answered. I stumbled over my words, trying to explain that someone had broken into my house. She asked if I had seen the man's face. I hadn't. She asked if I knew how long he had been inside. I didn't. What I did know, what I could feel in my gut, was that he had been there before I even arrived. The police showed up 20 minutes later, which, considering how empty the roads were, felt like an eternity. 2 officers checked the house while I waited outside. When they finally came back, they told me the same thing I was dreading. There's no sign of forced entry. One of them said, whoever he was, he either had a key or was already inside when you got here. I felt sick. The officer kept talking, but my ears were ringing. My gaze drifted back to the house, to the dark hallway beyond the open door. Something didn't make sense. If he was squatting in the house, why didn't he just leave when I arrived? Why had he waited until I was asleep to creep into my room? What had he been planning to do? I didn't sleep that night. After the cops left, I sat in my truck parked across the street watching the house. The front door was shut, the windows were dark, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still inside. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying. I drove to the nearest motel and booked a room for the next few nights. As soon as I got settled, I started searching online for anything I could find about the house. It took some digging, but eventually, I found something. 3 years ago, the previous tenant had vanished. A man named Tom Grayson had rented the place, lived there for almost a year. Then one night, he disappeared. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no struggle. His truck was still in the driveway, keys and wallet inside. The only thing missing was him. The police searched the house, the neighborhood, even the surrounding woods. Nothing. They never found him. But that wasn't the part that got to me. The part that sent a chill down my spine was what his neighbors had reported before he vanished. Tom had been complaining for weeks about someone coming into his house at night. He told them he would wake up and find doors unlocked, furniture moved, footprints in the dust on the floor. And the worst part? He said he would hear footsteps at night, slow, deliberate creaks moving closer and closer to his bedroom. I shut my laptop, my stomach twisting. I had to get out of there. Before leaving town for good, I had one last stop to make. I drove back to the house in broad daylight, making sure I wasn't alone. I brought a friend, one of my coworkers I had met earlier that week, just in case. When we pulled up, the house looked normal. The old wooden exterior, the small front porch, the same dusty windows. Nothing about it screamed danger, but I knew better. I walked up to the porch, hesitating before unlocking the door. It felt wrong stepping back inside. The air was heavy, thick with that same musty smell. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of the floorboards under our weight. I didn't go far. I just wanted to grab a couple of my things and get out. As I picked up my duffel bag from the bedroom, I heard my friend call out, his voice shaky. "Dude, look at this." I turned and saw him standing near the mirror in the hallway. At first, I didn't get it. It was just an old, stained mirror, probably as old as the house itself. But then he pointed. There were smudges on the glass, like fingerprints, long, streaky marks, as if someone had pressed their hands against the mirror from the other side. A cold chill ran through me. We didn't say another word. I grabbed my bag, and we left. I broke the lease that same day. To this day, I don't know who that man was. I don't know how long he had been inside the house before I arrived. And worst of all, I don't know if he was the only one. Finding a place after college wasn't easy, but I finally managed to rent a house with my best friend Damien. We had graduated together, and while I was still job hunting, he had already landed a well-paying job in Portland. The house was surprisingly cheap, almost suspiciously cheap, but it was way better than any apartment we could afford. The move-in went smoothly. We each picked a bedroom, and after a long day of unpacking, we made a trip to IKEA to grab some extra furniture for the living room. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, but we didn't mind. It felt like a fresh start. Then we found the note. Taped right to the front door, it was just a small card with a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. "Leave while you can." No name, no explanation. I stared at it for a moment, feeling a weird unease settle in my stomach. Damien laughed it off, saying it was probably some local kids trying to mess with us. I tried to shake off the feeling, but something about the note just didn't sit right with me. That night, as we settled in, I noticed someone standing across the street. It was a woman, just standing there staring at the house. Her face was hidden in the dim streetlight, but I could feel her eyes locked onto us. I blinked, and she was gone. Over the next few days, we tried to settle in, but something about the house felt off. Damien seemed fine, but I kept getting this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching me. One night, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone while the TV played in the background. The living room window faced the front yard, and at some point, I glanced up and froze. A figure stood outside, just beyond the window. It was the woman from the other night. She wasn't moving, just standing there watching. I felt my body tense. My first instinct was to grab my phone and take a picture, but as soon as I reached for it, she was gone. Just disappeared into the darkness. When I told Damien about it, he shrugged it off. "Maybe she's just a weird neighbor," he said, chuckling. "Or maybe she thinks we're cute." I didn't find it funny. That night, as I was falling asleep, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. Light, careful steps, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath, listening. Then silence. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew I wasn't. A week passed and things felt normal enough, until that night. I had a late shift at work, so I didn't get home until almost midnight. Damien was supposed to be home already. He got off work at 8. As I pulled into the driveway, a strange feeling crept over me. Something wasn't right. Then I saw it. The front door was wide open. All the lights inside were off. My stomach twisted. Damien was always careful about locking up. He'd never leave the door open like that. I parked quickly, grabbed my phone, and walked up the porch. "Damien?" I called out. No response. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart pounding. The house was dead silent. I took out my phone and immediately sent Damien a text. "Where are you?" The front door was open. The second I hit send, I heard a chime. I turned toward the kitchen. His phone was lighting up on the counter. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I wasn't sure what to do. Maybe he just ran out for something quick? But why would he leave his phone? And why was the door open? I swallowed hard and made my way upstairs. If something had happened, I needed to know. The hallway was dark, the air heavy with a strange stillness. I reached Damien's room. The door was open. I stepped inside, scanning the room. Everything looked normal. Then I heard a whisper behind me. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. Damien was peeking through a tiny crack in his closet door. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror. Before I could ask what the hell was going on, he whispered, "Did you see her?" My breath caught in my throat. "No," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" Damien's hand trembled as he motioned for me to call 911. I didn't ask questions. I did exactly what he said. As soon as I whispered into the phone explaining there was someone inside the house, we heard it. Footsteps, sprinting down the stairs. The police arrived in minutes, but by then, the intruder had already tried to escape. We heard them running through the house, slamming doors and knocking over furniture, but they didn't make it out. The cops caught her in the backyard, a woman. She was wild-eyed, her breath ragged, her face filled with something I can only describe as rage. Damien and I stood frozen as the officers restrained her, shouting at her to stay down. My mind was spinning. Who was she? Why was she here? And then Damien told me what happened. He got home that night, threw his stuff on the kitchen counter, and went upstairs to change. A few minutes later, he heard a loud noise from downstairs, like the front door slamming shut. Then footsteps. Someone was inside. He had no idea who or how many people there were. He was unarmed. His phone was downstairs, so he hid. But instead of hearing drawers opening or things being stolen, he heard something much more unsettling. Silence. Then, one by one, the lights in the house started turning off. Whoever was there wasn't just robbing the place. They were waiting. He didn't move. He stayed hidden in his closet for nearly 2 hours until I got home. And the worst part? When the cops searched the house, they found something horrifying in the basement. A small mattress, dirty clothes, empty food containers. She had been living there. The thought made my skin crawl. For how long? And why? But the most disturbing discovery was found on the basement floor. Scattered all around were dozens of photos. Photos of us. Sleeping. Laughing in the living room. Cooking in the kitchen. She had been watching us for weeks. We left that house as soon as our lease was up. And even now, sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still feel those eyes watching me, waiting. It happened when I had just moved across town into a small house on the outskirts of Olympia, Washington. It wasn't too far, maybe a 30-minute drive from my old apartment, but it felt completely isolated, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. No streetlights, no neighbors in sight, just me and the trees. It was the kind of quiet that should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt off. The house had belonged to a distant relative who passed away, and I got it for a ridiculously low price. At first, I thought I had lucked out. No more noisy city life, no more cramped spaces. But as soon as I moved in, I started getting this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. On my first evening there, while I was still unpacking, I heard a knock at the door. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find an older man, maybe in his late 50s, standing there. He was tall and lanky, with long, unkempt gray hair and hollow, sunken eyes. He had this stiff, almost robotic way of standing, like he wasn't used to interacting with people. "Evening," he said, his voice flat, almost rehearsed. Hey," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just wanted to see who moved in." His face didn't change at all. No smile, no curiosity, just a blank stare. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. "Yeah, just settling in. Got a lot of unpacking to do." He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, too still, like he was thinking about something. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off into the trees, disappearing into the fog that had rolled in. I closed the door, locking it instinctively. Maybe he was just a weird but harmless neighbor, but something about him left a bad taste in my mouth. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just on edge from the move. But deep down, I knew. Something was wrong. The next morning, I stepped outside and noticed footprints in the damp dirt, leading away from my house straight into the woods. My stomach twisted. They weren't mine. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some animal had wandered close, or maybe the guy from last night had just lingered a bit before leaving. The day went by as normal as it could. I spent most of it unpacking, setting up my workspace in the spare bedroom. But then, just as the sun was setting, there was another knock at the door. I froze. It was him again. He was wearing the exact same clothes as yesterday. Faded jeans, a flannel jacket that looked too thin for the cold. His expression was still that same dead-eyed stare. "How's everything coming along?" he asked, his voice just as empty as before. Good," I said, forcing a smile. "Still got a lot to do." He didn't react, didn't nod, didn't move. Just stood there, like he was forcing himself to be there, but didn't know why. The silence stretched too long. I felt my skin crawl. "Well," I finally said, shifting uncomfortably, "I should get back to it. Have a good night." I closed the door before he could say anything else. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting to hear footsteps walking away. But I didn't. Instead, after a long pause, a knock. This one was different, louder, more forceful. I clenched my jaw. "Look, I appreciate the welcome, but I really have a lot to do." I called through the door. Nothing. I peeked through the curtain covering the door's small window. He was still there, not moving, not leaving, just waiting. Another knock, even harder this time. That was it. I had enough. I marched to the door, ready to tell him off, but the moment I swung it open, my breath caught in my throat. He was closer now, just inches from my face. His dead, unblinking eyes locked onto mine, and then I saw it, peeking out from the sleeve of his jacket. The tip of a knife. I slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. Before I even had time to step back, he pounded on the door again. Hard. The whole frame shook, but he still wasn't saying anything, just standing there, pressing forward. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "There's a man outside my house," I whispered, peering through the curtain. He was still there, his eyes locked onto the door, like he could see me through it. "He has a knife." The operator kept asking me questions, but I barely heard her. The pounding stopped. I held my breath. Then, without warning, his shadow disappeared from the window. The silence was almost worse. Was he gone? Or just hiding? The cops wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes, so I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife and locked myself in the bedroom. I waited. Nothing happened. No more knocks, no more sounds. When the cops finally arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. They searched the area but didn't find anyone matching his description. "He might have just been some drifter passing through," one of the officers said. But even he didn't sound convinced. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, as I stepped outside to check my surroundings, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. A narrow trail of footprints leading into the trees. He had been watching me from the woods. I followed the tracks against every instinct telling me to turn back. They led deeper into the trees, where I stumbled upon something I hadn't noticed before. A small, rotting cabin. The door was slightly open. Inside it was dark, but I could make out a mattress on the floor, a few empty food cans, and something that made my stomach drop. A collection of knives. Different shapes, different sizes, all laid out in perfect order, and beside them, nailed to the wall, a photo of my house. My body went ice cold. This wasn't just some random guy. He had been watching me long before I moved in. I stumbled back, my breath coming fast. I needed to leave. Now. But just as I turned to run, the floor creaked. I wasn't alone. A shadow moved in the corner of the cabin, hidden in the darkness. And then, a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." I bolted out the door, crashing through the trees as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't stop running until I reached my house. I locked the doors, grabbed my car keys, and didn't even bother packing. I wasn't staying another night. I drove straight into town to a cheap motel and spent the night there. The next morning, I called a real estate agent and put the house up for sale immediately. The police checked the cabin, but it was empty. No knives, no photo, no trace of anyone ever living there. They told me there was nothing they could do. Might have just been a squatter, they said. But I know what I saw. I never went back. But sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, deliberate knock at the door.